92% of the world's advanced chips are manufactured inside a single 110-mile island that China has promised to absorb by 2027. Every F-35, every Patriot missile, every NATO radar runs on silicon NATO cannot make. Tonight, the dependency Washington engineered and the war it cannot win without Taiwan. On paper, NATO is the most technologically advanced military alliance in history. In practice, the alliance's entire war-fighting capability runs through a single supplier in a single city in a single island that sits 110 miles off the coast of the People's Republic of China. That supplier is Taiwan's Semiconductor Manufacturing Company, TSMC, and it produces roughly 92% of the world's advanced logic chips. Every F-35 flight computer, every Aegis radar processor, every Patriot interceptor seeker head, every NSA cryptographic accelerator. Made there, nowhere else at scale. The proximate cause of this exposure is not Chinese ambition. It is an American decision made in the 1990s. After the Cold War ended, the Pentagon shifted from owning its own foundries, what were called trusted foundries under DARPA, to buying commercial chips off the open market. The logic was simple. Commercial fabs were moving faster than military ones, and the savings were enormous. By 2003, the Department of Defense formally adopted a commercial off-the-shelf procurement doctrine. Military silicon became civilian silicon with a security wrapper. The structural cause runs deeper. A leading-edge fab, the kind that produces 3-nanometer chips, costs roughly $20 billion to build and takes between 4 and 6 years to bring online. A chip is etched using extreme ultraviolet lithography, or EUV, a process where a laser vaporizes droplets of tin to produce light at 13.5 nanometers, finer than a virus. Only one company in the world makes those machines, ASML in the Netherlands. Only 3 companies in the world can run them at scale: TSMC, Samsung, and a struggling Intel. This is not a market. It is a choke point with 3 valves, and 2 of them sit within range of Chinese missiles. The historical root goes back to 1987, when a Texas Instruments engineer named Morris Chang accepted an offer from Taiwan's government to build a foundry that would manufacture chips for everyone else's designs. The Reagan administration encouraged it. Taiwan would handle the dirty, capital-intensive manufacturing. America would keep the high-margin design work. For 30 years, that arrangement enriched both sides. It also handed Beijing a hostage worth more than any aircraft carrier. By 2027, the year CIA Director William Burns has publicly identified as Xi Jinping's deadline for military readiness over Taiwan. NATO's exposure becomes the entire game. If the strait closes for even 90 days, Lockheed Martin's F-35 production line halts. Raytheon's missile inventory cannot be replaced. Within 6 months, Allied air defense stockpiles run dry. And the man making that decision in Beijing already knows it. Here is the question nobody in Washington wants asked. How did the Pentagon, which spent the entire Cold War obsessing over supply chain sovereignty, allow itself to become dependent on foundries 7,000 miles away in a contested strait? The answer is a document most Americans have never heard of, Federal Acquisition Regulation Part 12, signed in 1994. FAR Part 12 mandated that the Department of Defense buy commercial products whenever possible, rather than custom military ones. The proximate cause was a Clinton-era efficiency drive led by then Deputy Defense Secretary William Perry. Perry's logic was airtight in 1994. Silicon Valley was outrunning the military's own labs. Buying commercial was faster and cheaper. Within a decade, the Trusted Foundry program, military-owned fabs in Vermont and Virginia, was gutted. By 2015, the Pentagon's last domestic leading-edge supplier, IBM's Burlington fab, was sold to Global Foundries, which promptly exited leading-edge production entirely. The structural cause is what defense economists call cost disease asymmetry. Military procurement budgets grow at 2 to 3% per year. Semiconductor capital costs grow at 13% per year. A fab that cost $1 billion in 2001 costs over $20 billion today. No defense budget on Earth can keep up. So, the Pentagon outsourced, and didn't just outsource manufacturing. It outsourced the strategic option of ever bringing it back. The historical root is older than Perry. It reaches back to the 1981 decision by Caspar Weinberger's Defense Department to allow Japanese semiconductor firms unlimited access to the U.S. market in exchange for security cooperation against the Soviets. That decision destroyed the American memory chip industry within 5 years. Intel exited DRAM in 1985. Micron survived only because Idaho potato farmers funded it. The same pattern, trading industrial base for short-term alliance leverage, was repeated with Taiwan in the 1990s, with China in the 2000s, and is being repeated right now with India. Which brings us to the forward projection. The CHIPS and Science Act, signed by President Biden in August 2022, allocated $39 billion to rebuild domestic fabrication. It sounds enormous. It is not. TSMC alone spent $36 billion in 2022 in a single year. The Arizona fab that TSMC is building in Phoenix will produce 4-nanometer chips by 2025, 2 generations behind what TSMC produces in Taiwan. By 2028, that gap will be 3 generations. The Pentagon will still be buying its most advanced silicon from Hsinchu. And by then, a second player will have entered the room. In December 2022, 4 months after Washington signed the CHIPS Act, Beijing did something the American press barely covered. It announced a $143 billion package, almost 4 times the size of the American response, aimed at one objective: breaking American chokeholds on Chinese semiconductor manufacturing equipment. The proximate cause was the October 2022 export control order issued by the Biden administration's Bureau of Industry and Security. That order did 3 specific things. It banned the sale of any chip manufactured using American technology at or below 14 nanometers to Chinese military end users. It banned American citizens from working at Chinese semiconductor companies, a clause that triggered overnight resignations at SMIC and YMTC. And it pressured ASML and Japan's Tokyo Electron to stop selling EUV and advanced deposition equipment to China. Beijing read this for what it was: technological siege warfare. The structural cause is something Chinese planners call the 2 markets, 2 systems doctrine, articulated by Xi Jinping in 2020. The thesis: globalization is over. China must build a parallel domestic technology stack capable of operating without any Western input. That doctrine is now formalized in China's 14th five-year plan, which targets 70% semiconductor self-sufficiency by 2025. They're not going to hit that number, but they have already hit something else, surprising the CIA. In August 2023, Huawei released the Mate 60 Pro phone running a 7-nanometer chip manufactured by SMIC in Shanghai, without EUV equipment, using a technique called multi-patterning that American analysts had assumed was impossible at scale. The historical root is the 2 bombs, 1 satellite program of 1958, when Mao decided China would build nuclear weapons and ICBMs without Soviet help after the Sino-Soviet split. It worked. China detonated a fission device in 1964, a hydrogen bomb in 1967, and orbited a satellite in 1970, faster than France, faster than India. Xi Jinping refers to this program in nearly every major semiconductor speech. The message to his domestic audience is unambiguous. We did it before, with less, under harder sanctions. We will do it again with silicon. The forward projection is what should keep Pentagon planners awake. By 2027, SMIC will produce 5-nanometer chips at meaningful volume, 3 years later than TSMC, but at scale Beijing can militarize. By 2029, the bifurcation of the global tech stack is complete. A Western ecosystem running on TSMC and Samsung, a Chinese ecosystem running on SMIC and YMTC. NATO sits inside the western half, and the supply route between those two halves runs through a strait Beijing intends to control. Let us run the scenario the Joint Chiefs run every quarter, the one that never appears in press briefings. It is called Protocol Clean. It is what happens in the first 72 hours of a Taiwan blockade. The surface event would look like a Chinese naval exercise. The proximate cause would be almost anything: a Taiwanese presidential statement, a U.S. arms sale, a routine PLA Navy drill that does not stand down. Within 48 hours, TSMC executes its own contingency. The fabs in Hsinchu are not destroyed. Taiwan's strategy is more subtle. The fabs are taken offline through what insiders call process drift, the suspension of the calibration cycles that EUV machines require every 6 hours. Within 72 hours, the machines are unusable until recalibrated by a team that exists almost entirely in the Netherlands. ASML has a kill switch. It has been confirmed by 2 Dutch government sources to Bloomberg. Beijing knows it exists. So does the Pentagon. The structural cause is what the alliance calls just-in-time defense logistics. Lockheed Martin holds roughly 30 days of advanced semiconductor inventory. Raytheon holds 45. Northrop Grumman holds 60. After that, production lines stop. The Patriot missile, the THAAD interceptor, the SM-6, the JS system, all halt within 90 days. The F-35 program, which depends on over 1,700 distinct semiconductor types, halts within 60. There is no surge capacity. There is no strategic reserve. The Defense Logistics Agency does not stockpile chips because chips become obsolete faster than they can be stored. The historical route is the 1973 oil embargo, the moment when OPEC cut Western oil supply by 25% and the entire NATO industrial base went into recession within 90 days. Henry Kissinger's response was the creation of the Strategic Petroleum Reserve in 1975. There is no equivalent for silicon. There cannot be. Oil is a commodity. Chips are designs, and a 2024 chip is useless in a 2027 weapon. The Pentagon studied creating a strategic chip reserve in 2021. It was abandoned as technically impossible. Forward projection. In the first quarter of 2026, expect the Pentagon to request a classified supplemental appropriation in the range of $12 to $18 billion for what will be publicly described as munitions industrial base resilience. The actual line item, buried on page roughly 340 of the request, will fund a secret program to embed trusted foundry capacity inside the Arizona, Ohio, and Texas fabs. By 2028, the first chips intended exclusively for nuclear command and control will roll off an Intel line in Columbus. 5 years too late. Here is the reframe. Everything you have just heard, TSMC, ASML, SMIC, the CHIPS Act, the 2027 deadline, is the story Washington wants you to focus on. The actual story is somewhere else. It is in Pyeongtaek, South Korea, where Samsung operates the world's largest semiconductor manufacturing complex, and in Yokkaichi, Japan, where Kioxia produces nearly a third of the world's NAND flash memory. The surface event is a series of trilateral summits, the so-called Chip 4 meetings between the US, Japan, South Korea, and Taiwan that began in 2022. The public framing is supply chain cooperation. The proximate cause is something else entirely. An internal Pentagon assessment, completed in late 2023, that concluded NATO's actual single point of failure is not Taiwan. It is the 280-mile corridor between Pyeongtaek and Yokkaichi, through which roughly 60% of the world's memory chips and 90% of its photoresist chemicals travel. North Korean artillery can reach Pyeongtaek. Chinese hypersonic missiles can reach Yokkaichi in under 7 minutes. The structural cause is the alliance's decision in 2022 to consolidate, not diversify. Washington concluded that building 3 independent semiconductor ecosystems was unaffordable. So it bet on tightening one, the U.S., Japan, Korea, Taiwan quadrilateral, and accepting the concentration risk. That is the bet Jake Sullivan, then National Security Advisor, made in a speech at the Special Competitive Studies Project in September 2022. He called it a small yard, high fence. What he did not say is that the yard contains every chip on Earth that matters. The historical root is the same logic that built NATO itself in 1949. Concentration of force in Western Europe to deter the Soviet Union, accepting the risk that all of NATO's industrial heartland sat within 500 miles of Soviet tanks. It worked for 40 years because the deterrent held. The question for the next 40 is whether the deterrent holds again, across a 6,000-mile maritime theater, against an adversary that, unlike the Soviet Union, holds the manufacturing base inside its own striking range. Forward projection. By 2030, three things converge. First, India emerges as the alliance's hedge, with Tata's dollar a fab producing 28-nanometer chips at scale. Useful for legacy systems, useless for the F-47 fighter. Second, a Pentagon program currently classified as Ramsey Phase 3 delivers the first fully domestic 2-nanometer chip from Intel's Ohio fab in 2029. 5 years late, 40% over budget. Third, and this is what your monthly electricity bill is paying for right now, every NATO defense budget will allocate between 4 and 6% to semiconductor security by 2030, money that used to fund ships, soldiers, and aircraft. The chip war has already conscripted the alliance. The viewer at home, paying more for everything from cars to washing machines, is funding a quiet remobilization most governments will not name. Because to name it would be to admit that the peace dividend of 1991 is over, and the next 30 years will be paid for by everyone who once benefited from it. The chip war is not coming. It started in 1987, accelerated in 1994, and entered its terminal phase in October 2022. Every NATO weapon now rolling off a production line is a hostage to a 110-mile strait that one man in Beijing has promised to close. I want to hear your prediction. Comment below. Does TSMC still operate freely in 2030? Or does Beijing's blockade come first? Subscribe, because there is another story unfolding right now. The one about why the U.S. Navy quietly tripled its submarine patrols off the Philippines last month. We're dropping that briefing next week.